All right, here's 13.1, Chapter 13. We're looking at the economy of the North, but we're also going to combine it together with the economy of the South. Lesson 3, jumping around a little bit, going to bring these two lessons together to compare and contrast the similarities and differences there. This should be fairly familiar to us, but we're going to add a few other layers of technology and innovation and some detail to define what's going on here in the economy. And in the next lesson, we'll see that there's a lot of movement into the North from across the globe that's going to help feed this economic shift that's going to continue from the market revolution, the first industrial revolution in the United States, and review some of those things that we talked about and those people from that time period as well. This is really a compare and contrast Venn diagram. Some similarities, not a lot of similarities between both sides in terms of what's there. Could be identified probably, but in each column there, just identify a specific thing, define, describe it, expand how and why it is an impact on the North. You're good to go. There's a lot of things that we could talk about here, especially what's going on in the North. There's two terms that are important for us here moving forward. One, antebellum. Notice the root word there, before, period of U.S. history before the Civil War. What is life like culturally and economically in both sections of the country? And then the term correlation. We're going to look at the relationship or a connection between two or more things, in this case cotton production and slavery, and analyze some maps to make some conclusions about that and make some concluding statements about that. Practice our writing a little bit. In terms of northern manufacturing and growth, by 1860, the Northeast and the New England factories produced about 2/3 of all U.S. manufactured goods, making slavery, of course, unnecessary, and we know that geography and climate has a lot to do with that as well. Alexander Hamilton's dream is coming true. It has come true. It's here. New technology is moving it forward at an even faster pace. There's a little bit of a formula that I don't have on the screen here that I do have in your outline notes there, and that is the production of cotton into cloth. Samuel Slater, Mr. Lowell, the factory system. We've got the planting and the harvesting of cotton, and then the production or the processing, of cotton into thread, into yarn, what have you. Well, how do you make that into something that's viable other than a big roll of cloth? Well, you've got to sew it, cut it into clothes and things of that nature. That's done by hand. Now, this Elias Howe comes up with a mechanical sewing machine, and you can sew things mechanically. They're much faster, producing suits and shirts and ties and things like that that otherwise are produced by hand. Otherwise produced by hand at a slow rate. It makes it expensive. Only a few people can afford something that is tailor-fitted. Now this sewing machine kicks out a finished product, and the product becomes cheaper, more available to the masses. More work and workers running things, that kind of stuff, making them even. Sewing machine factories, you might recognize the most successful, I think, sewing machine name. That would be Singer. Steam power and locomotives. Steam power is going to shift industry. It's going to allow it to geographically move. As you can see here with trains, railroads are going to be the driving force in the economy moving forward here, and even greater after the Civil War, connecting the country, moving things around in massive bulk quantities, especially growing in the North and the Midwest, connecting larger cities and the interior. And of course, we know with the interior, there's lots of agricultural produce that hungry mouths need in the East. And these things can also be shipped around the rest of the world for sale as well. Wheat, things like that. In the United States, Peter Cooper is the guy that, remember and know, comes up with the first American-made steam locomotive. They were actually created and invented in Great Britain in the first Industrial Revolution. And some of those made their way over here for purchase by Americans. But in terms of American one, it was the Tom Thumb, created by Cooper and for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And there's a nice little video story you can check out there about a race between the steam horse, or the iron horse, I should say, and horses. Which one was going to be better and more efficient and effective? Go check it out in terms of who won. It was kind of a win-loss kind of a thing for the railroad. But in 1840, we had about 3,000 miles of track. 20 years later, a massive explosion in railroads being built, 61,000 miles of track. And notice what section the country tends to have. Most of it, it's up here where industry wants to make gadgets, and thingamajigs for the settlement to the west, farmers and communities being built out here, some major cities growing as well, agricultural produce, back and forth. Everybody's got something the other side needs. Money's being made, and the railroads are making it hand over fist. No longer is it necessary to utilize just the rivers and steamboats. Their steamboats are going to be around a little bit yet, up until 1860, past 1860, into the 1870s and 1880s. But as steam power gets applied to boats and ships, they'll go away, and the railroads have taken a lot of their business away on the high seas as well. The shipping industry sees a transformation for a short, brief decade and a half, 2 decades or so, something like that. There's a new type of ship called the clipper ship. They're narrower, they're sleeker, they have more sails, they're faster, they sit higher in the water, meaning they're not as deep in the water, there's less resistance, and these things are moving things around along the oceans, coast of the oceans and across the oceans at a much faster pace. So not only things moving faster internally, but externally as well, until we get steam power on our ships, which will start happening in the Civil War a little bit and carry over into the afterwar time period. Those ships are kind of running things, but it's for a short period of time. Steam's going to take over everywhere. There's also a factor of communication, not only just people moving from point A to point B faster. They don't even have to move from point A to point B. They can send their voices or a message by electronic voice, you might say, on a wire established by Samuel Morse in 1838 with his Morse code and his telegraph. Wires are strung up along the railroads. It's the easiest way to get it anywhere. You clear a path through the wilderness along for these railroads, and alongside them you set up these wires and these transmission systems to communicate for the railroads as to when a train is beginning and ending and starting and coming and arriving and all that kind of thing, so they don't crash, because usually there's just one railroad track, and so you have to wait until one gets to a certain point to kind of pull over and wait for another one to pass. But this is going to really also be a major boost for the economy as well. Increased buying and selling of goods because there's communication of deals being made going on here and all this kind of a thing. Business contracts. Massive advantage here for the economy of the United States, and especially for, I'll go back a little bit, for the North. All right, especially for the North. They're going to be pretty much everywhere, but in the North, these telegraph lines are everywhere. So this is a significant thing. The Associated Press, you might be familiar with it today. It's still around yet today. A news agency is established here, communicating information and events and things of that nature. Samuel Morse, big deal. We'll take a look at a clip about him a little bit later on as well. In the North, there's a great variety of agriculture being produced. As with the colonial period, there's a variety of agriculture in the colonial regions, but as we move into the West, there's a growth of this breadbasket from Pennsylvania, the growth of wheat, grains, things of that nature that can be made into human food and or animal food that expands in here to the West. You can see from the key what's going on where. And these become the cash crops of the North, things that you can eat. Right? These things are also produced in the South. Sorry, I'm jumping around here a little bit. They're also grown in the South, but not as a major moneymaker. More of to feed my pigs, or to feed my family, or for a little bit of maybe extra money here and there. Right? So there is some cash crop growth of agriculture in the North on a very large scale. Why is that? It's very large in scale and explosive in size when we get to the development of things like the McCormick Reaper. You know, the Grim Reaper, the dude that comes to take everybody's life at some point in time, right, with this big thing called a scythe, very super sharp. Well, this is what people used to cut their crops and or weeds back in the old days. That's how they got their six-pack abs. I'm guessing they probably had more like 12-pack abs, because if you do that all day, you're looking pretty trim. Those guys are pretty lean-looking dudes. But it's slow. You can only plant so much. Therefore, you're not making as much money, right? So with this Reaper, this dude Cyrus McCormick comes up with, it's pulled by a horse. It is mechanical. It cuts it. It's going to eventually bind it into a bundle, throw it on the ground, and then you just pick them up. Prior to that, people had to put them in a bundle, then tie them into a bundle, then pick them up. and the rate at which it was cut was much smaller, and so, or much lower, and so this cutting by hand and this manual labor goes out the door. And this coincides with, a few years later, the development of something called the steel plow. This is by John Deere. It's the John Deere you know. Check out the big fancy shiny tractor that I always wanted. It is a plow that's made out of steel, which is much harder and more difficult to break than the previous iron steel, plows. And the real key to this thing was also the fact that on the edge here there was a removable thing called a shear, and you could unbolt it and bolt in a new one when the old one got dull. And when this thing was used, it cut through the really hard. As we move it, we're going to start moving into the west across the Mississippi River into the 1840s and 1850s. It was it made it possible for farmers to cut this thing called sod. And sod was basically the foot to 2 feet deep of soil that was interwoven in a web of roots from the prairie grasses that had been growing there for eons, and it was a drier region. It's not a desert. It was called the Great American Desert, but it was an arid region, and because it was arid and dry, the ground was harder, and these plows just had a hard time cutting into it. You need to get into it deep in order to get enough soil up to plant a crop. And so this thing made it possible to plant much more massive acreage than before, and to plant places like Minnesota where there was a lot of rocks and stumps and trees that also broke these iron plows. And so not only do we have a way of getting it off the field if we plow it up, but now we can plow it up in larger amounts and plant more. But that's a problem if you don't have something to get it off the field in a to process the crop after you've gotten it off the field in a fast fashion. And this is similar to our scenario with the cotton gin, in that we have the development of the thresher. And the thresher is going to basically take the stalk and separate the grain off of it without people having to do it by hand or horses walking over it or other methods of getting it off the stalk. This is going to do it mechanically. Now this is what you see here is a picture of it more toward the in the post-Civil War time period. We have steam tractors and things like that that are developed to run these things. But the first ones were small, but they still separated grain from the straw at a fast rate. Now that means you can feed and get massive amounts of grain out to hungry mouths and the rest of the world that's willing to pay for it. And if you can make it faster, you can make it cheaper, then people are going to buy yours more likely than somebody else that's producing it more expensively at a slow rate. Slow means expensive. So this is going to be big for the Civil War and the Civil War time period, feeding those massive populations and armies later on when we get to the Civil War. And the agricultural wealth in the North is going to explode as well. And guess what? More people are going to come to the United States because of that. They want to be farmers and get that piece of land that most people in the world don't have and own on their own. These are some of the things you could maybe chart and talk about and identify, cite, and describe that are impacting the economy of the North. Don't forget to talk about maybe a little bit of geography as well. Get that left side done. Getting to lesson 3, we'll take a look again at some geography and do some correlations of population versus cotton production and make some statements about that with a little activity here. This map shows a little bit of what we're talking about, the development of the South, in a particularly big part of the South over time between 1820 and 1860, for example. These are the two maps we're going to look at in terms of population versus production of cotton. But what is it that is helping things grow in the South and driving the economy in the South? This should be a lot of review for us here. Eli Whitney, thank you very much, in 1793, creating that cotton gin. The gin, they'll get bigger. This one is a hand crank. Later on, they'll be driven by horses and steam power as well later on. Again, steam power, it's not just staying in the North, it's moving everywhere. If you have a source of creating heat, wood or coal, you can make steam and you can drive and power things very easily. But this cotton gin is feeding the European textile industry as well as the textile industry in the United States. And this is the big money maker and what's driving things in the South. It's extremely profitable. There's only a small number of Americans in the South that are actually making large amounts of money off of this cotton. Because it is very labor intensive to put into the ground, and to get a slave, to buy a slave, it takes some money up front. Slaves are expensive. We'll take a look at that a little bit later on. There are two Souths here in this southern region, and that is one, you should add here, North Carolina, please. It's the upper South. North Carolina up to Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas. You don't necessarily see it right here, but we should add also Missouri. This is going to be important for us to consider and understand and know when we see future events that get us into the Civil War here. There are two different mindsets in the South and intensities of Southern life. And here, the intensity of economy is all about tobacco and hemp, wheat and vegetables. There is a little bit of manufacturing up here that isn't seen in the South. Geography and climate is part of this. Because slavery is there, but it's not so intense as in the South because it is heavily in the deep South, I should say, the lower South, driven by cotton. We have the establishment and development over time of people who are basically buyers and sellers of slaves, kind of like people that buy and sell any other kind of good that other people want, or automobiles or cars or equipment kind of thing. So that is what is going on in the South. And again, you can see in the upper South, got some corn being grown there, and things like that. Some other things that are what would be a cash crop in the North, but not on as large a scale. Climate is a little bit cooler. Growing season is less. 1808, the Constitution banned the importation of slaves, but the slave population again is growing because of that cotton gin. Growth of cotton. Growth of cotton. Need more land, cut it up, expand west, expand west, expand west. The lower South is a little bit of North Carolina also, South Carolina, but primarily South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida, and they have become, in the time period we're seeing here, 1820 to 1860, heavily committed to cotton. Prior to that, in the colonial period, tobacco, rice, a food crop, very profitable food crop for the colonies at that time and for England and the rest of Europe, primarily England before the American Revolution. Those were the dominant things. But it is, again, cotton that takes over. And by the time we get to this year of 1860, most of U.S. money made from the sale of goods to other countries was from cotton. Almost 60% of our money from exports comes from cotton. And so this map is important to understand and know and see the differences here. Again, we've got the upper South, right along the Ohio River, Missouri, Maryland, Pennsylvania line, right in here. Kind of see where the colors change, right in here. Here's our lower South, right? So there are two Souths in the United States. This chart also shows what's going on there in terms of numbers. Again, in terms of some other charts and bar graphs, we'll take a look at a little bit more. This is what a bale of cotton looks like, very large, packed tight. Why is it that the South doesn't get into industry? One, cotton is just so darn valuable and profitable. This is the main reason. In order to set up a factory, and there were a few factories, textile mills. You can see a few of them down here, right? It would make sense to have a textile mill where the cotton is grown, right across from the field, right? There's a few of them, but look at the difference up here. It takes a good amount of money or capital, straight cash, to come up with the building of a factory and establish a factory. In the South, most of their land, most of their capital or money is tied up in land or slaves. And so to come up with a factory, you would have to, if you're a moneyed or a wealthy person, measured in land or slaves in the South, you'd have to sell those things. Well, it doesn't make sense to do that necessarily because I'm making plenty of money and lots of money, and I have plenty of demand for my cotton as it is. But at the same time, if I did even have a industry or a factory of textile mill, or anything else for that matter, there isn't a large population down here that's going to buy it. They're already getting it from somewhere else that's established and probably can make it cheaper than I can in the South. And another large portion of the population doesn't even buy anything at all. Slaves don't have money. They don't buy anything at all. So there isn't a big demand or a market for manufactured goods if I were to try and come up with a factory or a business in the South to sell those things to Southerners. they're going to them and getting them cheaper already from somewhere else. And Southerners simply didn't want that. If you remember that little quote from Thomas Jefferson, a God-given occupation in life is to be a farmer, to toil in the soil. That kind of rhymes. Toil in the soil. Why would we want to do anything else? We've got lots of land, great climate. Let the workbench stay in Europe. We'll buy the manufactured stuff from them. So everything is set and seemingly perfect in the South, and just not necessary to do anything else. Things are going well for those that have a large amount of money. For those that didn't have a large amount of money that couldn't buy slaves, they're hoping they someday can get to that status and perhaps own those slaves to make the big money. So Southern transportation as well is much different. Most towns are located on the coast or along rivers in the South, and if we need something transported, it gets shoved along onto the rivers. A few railroads in a few places that maybe connect up with some of the rivers. The roads tend to be poor. Again, if you remember the canals that were built in the post-War of 1812 era are built with tax dollars. And in the South, they're not too into the tax meat to build things, kind of stuff. That's not something we need. They didn't really like it for spending it on the railroads and transportation systems in the North. If they did have railroads in the South, they tend to be pretty short. They were local. They were not interlinked. There's only about a third of the nation's rail lines were in the South. Therefore, when we get to our Civil War, this is going to be a big disadvantage. Quite often, a lot of the railroad lines, and I don't have this on the outline, but quite often the railroad lines were different sized tracks. So one train could go from here to here, but then if you wanted to get your product to point C, you would have to unload it off of train A and load it back on to train B because the track was a different size. That train would only run on a certain segment of track. Up here, these railroad tracks tend to be all the same size, standard, and they could literally run from New York City all the way out here to Chicago and back on any combination of roads you pretty much wanted to for the most part, if you really had to. Because of this, also, there's fewer telegraph lines and fewer capabilities of communicating, which will be a factor in the Civil War as well. Big advantage for the North. Some things you can talk about in the North-South economy. Make sure you cite and identify some of those things specifically talked about. Review it, pull it from that right side to the left, do a little summary on it. Be ready for a little assessment perhaps, and we'll definitely take a look at some maps and analyze what's going on geographically here and make some correlations between pieces of information on different maps. Have a good day. Make the hay.